Benjamin Franklin wasn't just a founding father. He ran one of the most secretive spy networks in London during the American Revolution. Welcome back to Untold Golden History. Today, we reveal Franklin's covert operations that helped America gain independence. Benjamin Franklin's hidden spy network in London. Section 1. The Masterminded Shadow. London, winter of 1772. The fog rolled across the cobblestone streets like a living creature, thick, slow, almost conscious, smothering the gas lamps until each light flickered like a dying star. Carriages clattered through the mist, hooves striking stone, wheels slicing through puddles left by the previous night's cold rain. In the distance, St. Paul's Cathedral stood as a vague silhouette, its great dome barely visible through the swirling gray haze. In a quiet townhouse on Craven Street, behind an unassuming blue door, an elderly man with silver hair sat at his desk, carefully sealing a letter with a small iron stamp engraved with an owl. Benjamin Franklin, scientist, printer, diplomat, and a man harboring secrets that could shatter empires. The world knew him as charming and wise. London society adored him. The Royal Society hailed his intellect. Parliament tolerated his presence. Aristocrats invited him to private salons and evenings of wine, music, and debate. No one suspected that the genial, witty philosopher, with spectacles perched on his nose, was quietly building one of the most sophisticated spy networks the British Empire had ever seen. Franklin pressed the seal into the cooling wax, watching as the owl impression hardened. A knock came at the back entrance. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. The signal. He opened the door just enough to allow a young man in his early 20s to slip inside. His coat was soaked from rain, hair dripping beneath his tricorn hat. "You weren't followed?" Franklin asked. "No, sir," the man whispered. "I took the long route across the Strand, then doubled back by the river, just as you instructed." "Good. Close the door, quickly." The courier obeyed, shivering as the warmth of the small room enveloped him. Franklin handed him the sealed letter. "This must reach Paris, not through the diplomatic pouch, through our route. You understand?" The courier nodded. "The Brotherhood of the White Quill awaits in Calais." Franklin allowed himself a faint smile. A strange name, yes, but one the British authorities would never guess the meaning of. Because the White Quill wasn't a group of poets or scholars. It was a ring of spies. Men, women, merchants, servants, sailors, diplomats, all loyal to the American cause. Some were British by birth, but American by conviction. Others were French sympathizers. A few were paid. Many were volunteers who believed in the ideals Franklin preached so passionately at London dinners. Liberty, representation, the rights of common people. But these ideas were dangerous in London, and Franklin knew it better than anyone. "Go," Franklin said, "before the watchmen make their rounds." The courier bowed slightly and vanished into the fog. Franklin locked the door, exhaled deeply, and leaned against the desk. He wasn't trembling. Benjamin Franklin rarely trembled, but he felt the weight of what he was doing pressing down on him. If the British government ever discovered the web he was spinning, he wouldn't simply be expelled. He would be executed for treason. But Franklin was a man who had learned to master fear long ago. He blew out the candle and sat in darkness for several minutes, listening to the heartbeat of London outside his window. Carriages, footsteps, distant voices, rainwater dripping from roof ledges. London was alive, crowded, noisy, polluted, powerful, and Franklin was determined to use that power against the empire.
The double life begins. By morning, Franklin transformed back into the man the British elites expected to see. A witty gentleman in a fur cap, a philosopher who charmed duchesses, a scientist who experimented with electricity and glass harmonicas, a harmless colonial who spoke eloquently while appearing politically harmless. He attended salons in Westminster, sipping tea while discussing natural philosophy. He dined with members of the House of Lords. He sat politely through debates in Parliament. He accepted invitations from the King's ministers. But beneath his calm smile, his mind was always calculating. Every overheard whisper, every rumor about troop movements, every naval shipment delay, every secret struggle inside Parliament, all of it became intelligence. Sometimes he delivered messages with coded jokes. Sometimes he tucked letters inside the hollowed spine of books. Sometimes he used lemon ink that only revealed itself when held near a flame. Franklin's spy network wasn't made of James Bond-type agents. It was built using people no one noticed. A maid who worked for a British general, a ship carpenter who overheard officers drinking too much rum, a clerk in the post office who sorted diplomatic mail, a banker who quietly tracked war loans, a bookseller who smuggled coded papers between pages. Franklin had spent decades mastering the art of subtle influence. He knew how to charm a room. He knew how to read people's weaknesses. He knew how to listen without seeming to listen. That was his greatest gift. He wasn't a spy because he dressed in shadows. He was a spy because people underestimated him. The first great secret. Late one evening, while attending a private supper hosted by Sir John Pringle, Franklin overheard a conversation that chilled him. Two high-ranking British officers were speaking, not realizing Franklin could hear them from the adjacent room. "Word is the king wants to send 20,000 regulars to America." 20,000? Good God, that will crush any rebellion. Crush? They'll barely stand a chance. And Franklin sits here pretending to be our friend. The officers laughed. Franklin did not. He excused himself quietly and left the supper without finishing his wine. That night, he wrote furiously by candlelight, documenting every detail. This intelligence would shape America's early strategy for years, and Washington later relied on this very insight to prepare for the British invasion. He sealed the letter, then burned his notes. No evidence could remain. When dawn arrived, he smiled politely at his landlady, paid her for the week's meals, and walked to Parliament as though nothing unusual had happened. But deep inside, a storm was forming. London was becoming a battleground, and Franklin, America's most underestimated diplomat, was becoming its most dangerous secret agent. For the next several weeks, Franklin moved carefully through the city, blending into the rhythm of London life with the skill of a seasoned actor. He walked daily along the Strand, pretending to admire print shops and jewelers. He visited coffee houses where philosophers debated politics over muddy cups of roast. He appeared at gatherings of aristocrats, lending his disarming humor to lighten discussions that could have turned hostile. Yet beneath this routine, something else was happening. The network was growing. One evening, Franklin sat in the dim back room of a small apothecary shop near Fleet Street. The room smelled faintly of lavender, bitter herbs, and alcohol. Shelves lined the walls, bottles of tonics, powders, and tinctures, but behind them was a false panel that concealed something far more dangerous. A stack of coded letters, intelligence reports, and maps marked with British troop allocations. Across from Franklin stood a tall man with broad shoulders and soot-stained hands, a blacksmith named Gregory Whitfield. His arms were thick from years of hammering iron, but his voice was soft, with the gentle tone of a man who spent his life listening more than speaking. "You understand the risk," Franklin said quietly. Whitfield nodded. "I do. But after what the Crown did to my brother, after they dragged him away for speaking against the Stamp Act, this is the least I can do." Franklin studied his face. Loyalty was a fragile thing, but hatred? That could make a man fearless. "Your access to the militia stables will be crucial," Franklin said. "Horses move messages faster than men, and officers talk freely when they think the help is death." Whitfield chuckled bitterly. "They think blacksmiths are too simple to understand military matters." "Let them think so," Franklin replied. "Their arrogance is our advantage." Whitfield slipped Franklin a folded note. "From the officer I told you about, the one who drinks too much." Franklin opened it carefully. Inside was a list of names, British naval captains being considered for deployment to America. Several of them were known to be exceptionally aggressive commanders. Franklin's stomach tightened. If these men were unleashed on the colonies, the war could escalate into something far more brutal than anyone expected. "This is excellent," Franklin whispered. "It will help Washington prepare." He slid the paper into a hidden compartment beneath the apothecary's workbench. "We'll send it out tonight." Whitfield hesitated before leaving. "Dr. Franklin, if they catch me—" "They won't, because your name will never appear on anything we send." Whitfield left through the back door and disappeared into the street, swallowed by the night. Franklin stood alone in the small room, listening to the ticking of the apothecary's clock. Every tick felt like a reminder that time was running out, for America, for the network, for him. He extinguished the lantern and slipped out into the alley. Above him, the moon peeked through the clouds, illuminating the narrow lane. Franklin clutched his cloak tighter. London could be beautiful at night, but beauty meant nothing when the world's greatest empire was hunting the very ideas he was trying to protect. The trap in the coffee house. A few days later, Franklin entered the bustling Turk's Head coffee house. The air was thick with the smell of roasted beans, wet wool coats, and sweat. People crowded the narrow tables, journalists scribbling notes, merchants arguing over tariffs, and political radicals whispering criticisms of Parliament. It was one of Franklin's favorite hunting grounds. Here conversations overflowed like spilled ale, and people who talked too much were priceless. A thin man with bushy eyebrows flagged Franklin down. "Dr. Franklin, over here," he called. It was Miles Drew, a London printer sympathetic to the American cause. Franklin sat across from him. Drew leaned in, voice trembling with urgency. "Someone was asking about you," he whispered. "A man in a navy coat. He said he had orders from the post office, but he didn't look like an officer." Franklin felt a cold stab in his chest. "Did he ask where I live?" "Not directly, but he asked about your routine. When you come here, whether you meet anyone privately." Franklin's jaw tightened. The British government had begun to suspect him. He lowered his voice. "Miles, listen carefully. If that man returns, you never met me. You've only ever seen me speak at public lectures, nothing more." Drew swallowed hard. "Of course." Franklin placed a reassuring hand on the printer's arm. "You've done well. Now, go home and stay quiet." As Drew slipped out the side door, Franklin noticed the man Miles described, sitting at a corner table, pretending to read a newspaper while peering over the edge. Their eyes met briefly. Franklin felt a chill. He stood, straightened his coat, and walked calmly out of the coffee house. But inside his mind, alarm bells were ringing. He needed to act, the network needed to tighten, and the flow of intelligence had to continue, before it was too late. The secret postmaster. That night, Franklin visited a decrepit post office near Charing Cross. The building was damp, the ceiling low, the walls cracked. It was the perfect place for secrets because no one bothered to look inside. In a small room lit by a single candle sat a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, Henry Carleton, a postal clerk who had grown disillusioned with the Crown after witnessing widespread corruption inside the postal service. "You're late," Franklin muttered as he entered. "I had a shadow on my way here," Franklin replied. "I had to lose him." Henry Carleton's hands trembled slightly as he slid a wooden box across the table. "These are the documents you asked for." Franklin opened the box. Inside were dozens of intercepted letters, correspondence between British generals, ministers, governors, and naval officers. Carleton had risked everything to steal them from the sorting room. Franklin lifted one envelope and smiled. It bore the seal of Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State for the Colonies. "Did anyone
Notice?" Franklin asked. "No. I swapped them with blank envelopes and resealed the originals once you were done with them last time, but—" Carleton hesitated. "But what?" "There are rumors," he whispered. "They're saying the Crown suspects a breach in the postal system. They may start investigating." Franklin closed the box and locked it with a tiny brass key. "Then we must accelerate everything," he said. "From now on, the letters must be passed through intermediaries. You cannot be seen giving me anything." Carleton nodded grimly. "Understood." Franklin placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are doing more for America than you know." Carleton's eyes softened. "I'm not doing it for America, sir. I'm doing it because the people who run this empire care nothing about justice." Franklin understood that sentiment too well. A London dinner with dangerous ears. Later that week, Franklin attended a lavish dinner at the home of Lord Hillsborough, one of the Crown's most influential ministers and one of Franklin's harshest adversaries. The table glittered with silverware. Wine glasses sparkled beneath chandeliers. Servants moved silently, pouring wine, clearing plates, and pretending not to hear anything. Franklin sat among members of Parliament, naval officers, and aristocrats dressed in embroidered coats. "Tell me, Dr. Franklin," Hillsborough said with a thin smile, "what is the mood in your colonies? Still rebellious?" Franklin smiled politely. "Colonists simply wish to be treated with fairness, my lord, nothing more." Another minister snorted. "Fairness? They're lucky the Crown tolerates their complaints." Franklin sipped his wine. "I have always believed that happy subjects make a happy empire." Hillsborough leaned in. "And unhappy subjects?" Franklin met his gaze with icy calm. "Become expensive to rule." A few men choked on their drinks. Someone laughed nervously. But Franklin was not being theatrical. He was measuring them, testing their confidence, their fears, their certainty that America could never break free. He listened more than he spoke. He caught snippets of gossip. Reinforcements being discussed, possibly 30 ships. Parliament divided. Some believed the colonies must be taught a lesson. Adams and the radicals worsening things. General Gage growing impatient. Every sentence, every slip of the tongue, every arrogant remark, Franklin memorized it all. Later that night, he would transcribe every detail into a ciphered report. London was giving him everything he needed. Because no one, absolutely no one, suspected that the elderly philosopher dining among them was quietly dismantling their empire from within. The fire crackled softly in the dimly lit parlor of Craven Street, the London house where Benjamin Franklin lived during his years as colonial representative. Rain hammered against the windows, and a fog rolled down the narrow street outside, thick enough to blur the lamps. The city felt restless, Whispers of political tension moved like the wind between taverns, coffee houses, and Parliament's marble hallways. Franklin sat alone at his desk, spectacles low on his nose, quill resting between his fingers. But that night, he wasn't drafting a political letter. He was waiting. At the exact stroke of midnight, 3 gentle knocks sounded on the back door. Not the front. Never the front. Franklin didn't move immediately. Instead, he closed the leather-bound journal on his desk, the one containing coded symbols, ink blots in strategic clusters, and entries written in a script unreadable to even the trained eyes of British clerks. Then he stood and walked quietly down the hall. He unlatched the door. A young man stepped inside, drenched, wearing a British naval coat that didn't quite fit his frame. "Late again, Mr. Wilkes," Franklin said, voice dry but calm. "They nearly caught me, sir," he whispered. "There were patrolmen at every crossing." Franklin locked the door behind him. "No, my boy," he replied. "They weren't patrolling by chance. They were looking for someone. The British are tightening their surveillance." Wilkes hesitated. "You mean someone like me?" Franklin gave a faint smile. "No, someone like me." He took the packet, thin but firm, and immediately placed it under a lamp. Franklin didn't tear it open. Instead, he tilted it, studying the stitching, the wax residue, the fibers of the paper. Then he nodded. "Mary Musgrove delivered it, I see. She uses this sealing pattern when she needs urgency." Wilkes blinked. "You recognize that just by the wax?" Franklin chuckled softly. "My boy, you must never underestimate the importance of noticing everything." He finally opened the package. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Barely anything written on it. Only 4 lines of obscure symbols that looked almost childish. But Franklin's eyes sharpened. "It's a diversion cipher. The message is hidden between the lines. Invisible ink." Wilkes leaned closer. "What does it say?" Franklin read silently. Then he looked up, expression darker than Wilkes had ever seen. "General Gage has ordered an immediate expansion of troop movement. Not routine patrols, not intimidation, something much larger." "Where?" Wilkes asked. Franklin said, "Boston. They're preparing to crack down violently, far more aggressively than Parliament had admitted." Wilkes stepped back, breath caught. "This could spark an open war." Franklin folded the message carefully. "My dear boy," he said quietly, "the war has already begun. Only the British have yet to announce it." The double life. To London society, Benjamin Franklin was the charming American scientist who dazzled aristocrats with electricity demonstrations and witty speeches, a harmless intellectual, a philosopher. That version of him was a mask. Behind closed doors, Franklin's evenings were consumed with decoding messages, coordinating agents, and passing intelligence to patriots across the Atlantic. His network wasn't the largest, not by numbers, but it was the smartest. It relied on servants in wealthy British homes, dock workers who heard naval chatter, sympathetic members of Parliament, widows running taverns near military barracks, scientists who traded information like currency. London's underbelly became Franklin's second home. He used the London coffee houses, especially the bustling ones in Covent Garden and Fleet Street, as information marketplaces. To strangers, he looked like just another scholar sipping chocolate or reading pamphlets. But beneath the table, his foot tapped coded rhythms to signal safe approach or danger to undercover agents. He learned to listen without seeming attentive, to observe without staring, to influence without speaking directly. Behind his spectacles, his eyes cataloged everything: who entered a room first, who exited last, who whispered more than they drank, who laughed too loudly, who avoided talking about certain topics. Knowledge was power, and Franklin absorbed everything. The chessboard of London. London itself was a battlefield, just one made of whispers instead of bullets. At tea gatherings, aristocrats unknowingly revealed British naval strategies. At Parliament receptions, debates over tax policies revealed troop movements. In smoky taverns, British soldiers rambled drunkenly about their next deployments. Franklin memorized it all. But he was careful. He never wrote sensitive information directly. He disguised his notes in the margins of scientific papers, jotted electric conductivity tests that actually encoded military numbers, or air pressure measurements that indicated political hostility levels. Every scientific experiment was also a cover operation. London saw him as brilliant. They had no idea he was dangerous. But the greatest challenge wasn't British intelligence. It was the man living under the same roof. William Franklin, Benjamin's own son. Royal governor, loyalist, devoted servant of the crown. The two men shared blood, memories, breakfast conversations, but not loyalties. William suspected nothing yet, but soon Franklin feared suspicion would turn into something far worse. And when father and son stood on opposite sides of the revolution, only one would walk away unbroken. Franklin folded another coded letter, sealed it, and placed it in a drawer. The fog outside thickened. London's bells tolled softly through the night. Franklin extinguished the lamp, knowing one truth. The revolution's fate depended not on muskets across the ocean, but on secrets whispered in the dark corridors of London. Section 2.
Secret Codes and Ciphers. London slept under a blanket of fog, but Benjamin Franklin's mind never rested. Where Section 1 revealed the birth of his espionage circle, Section 2 exposed its lifeblood. Communication hidden beneath ordinary ink. Messages passed under the noses of British officers. And codes so advanced that some remain unbroken to this day. Franklin understood one truth early. A message is only as powerful as its concealment. If the British intercepted even a single letter, the entire network could collapse. Agents arrested, ships seized, colonial leaders exposed, and his own life ended with a rope around his neck. So Franklin created a system of codes and ciphers so intricate, so deceptively simple, that even professional cryptologists of the Crown often failed to decipher them. The Room of Secrets inside Franklin's house on Craven Street. There was a narrow attic room, seldom used and nearly impossible to reach without causing the floorboards to creak. Most visitors believed Franklin kept scientific tools there. But the attic was far more dangerous. It contained locked cabinets filled with cipher wheels, small bottles of invisible inks, heat-generated chemical mixtures, maps with faint, nearly invisible markings, stacks of books hollowed from the inside, and journals written in mirror writing, readable only with reflection. Only 3 people besides Franklin knew this room existed. None survived long after the Revolution. Late one foggy night, Franklin entered the attic carrying a newly intercepted British packet. Inside the envelope was a normal-looking merchant invoice. But Franklin recognized something odd. The ink on 3 letters was darker than the rest. He smiled. "British intelligence," he whispered. "Your carelessness surprises me." He picked up a small brush,
dipped it into a copper-blue chemical powder, and lightly stroked the page. As if waking from a shallow sleep, a second layer of writing shimmered into view. A British naval officer had accidentally pressed too hard while writing a hidden message, leaving microscopic indentations on the page. The chemical powder filled the grooves, revealing the secret text. Franklin read it aloud. Urgent. New orders to transport additional Redcoat regiments to Boston. Departure within 12 days. Franklin exhaled slowly. These are the tremors before the earthquake. The invisible ink that changed everything. Franklin didn't invent invisible ink, but he improved it beyond anything Europe had seen. He tested dozens of mixtures: lemon juice, milk, onion juice, vinegar. But these were amateur tools, too easy to discover, too easy to destroy. Instead, Franklin experimented with iron sulfate solutions, tannin-based reagents, copperous ink requiring special vapor activation, heat-sensitive botanical extracts, and dual-phase inks that revealed only half the message until a second chemical was applied. This made Franklin's network nearly impossible to infiltrate. Even if British officers heeded a letter, only part of the message appeared. To the British, the incomplete message looked like a children's riddle, useless, laughable. But colonial generals who received the letters had the second chemical sent separately in innocuous cargo ships labeled as olive oil, soap, or textile dye. Only when the two chemicals were combined did the full intelligence emerge. This method, unlike anything used by Europe's spy agencies, later influenced modern CIA techniques. The Gentleman's Coffee House ciphers. London coffeehouses were the heart of political gossip. Members of Parliament, businessmen, scientists, soldiers, they all gathered there. But few knew Franklin wasn't just listening. He was collecting. Franklin designed a cipher that disguised political intelligence as everyday chatter. His agents memorized key numeric values. Coffee means 3. Chocolate means 9. Biscuit means 14. Lamp means 7. Window means 2. Smoke means 11. Door means 6. When agents casually ordered a drink or complained about the weather, they weren't speaking, they were encoding. For example, the coffee is cold today, and the windows are drafty. Actually meant 3 minus 2 equals British troop relocation from New York to Boston confirmed. This code was simple to use verbally, but impossible for outsiders to decode without the key. Franklin stored the master key inside the spine of a book titled On Electricity, assuming, correctly, that no British officer would ever bother reading it. The London Spy Who Wrote with Darkness. One of Franklin's most remarkable operatives was a woman known only as E. No records of her true identity survived. Franklin erased them personally, both to protect her and because he feared the British would torture her if found. E mastered a code unlike any other. She used negative space. She wrote her letters in perfectly clean handwriting, but the important part wasn't the words she wrote. It was the spaces between them. Franklin discovered her method when she delivered an unusually plain note. The cat wanders freely tonight. Streets quiet. Weather cold. It seemed trivial. until Franklin placed a ruler beneath the lines and realized the spacing formed a sequence: wide, narrow, narrow, wide, repeating. This spacing corresponded to a cipher Franklin had designed years earlier, based on typesetter spacing widths used by London printers. When decoded, the message revealed British generals meeting secretly at Whitehall, tonight. Without E, Franklin would have never learned that the British were planning to intersect American supply routes. She disappeared after 1775. Franklin suspected the British discovered her. He carried the guilt for years. The codebook that could destroy an empire. The most dangerous item Franklin ever created wasn't a letter or a cipher. It was a small leather-bound codebook containing thousands of paired meanings. Rain means secret meeting. Harvest means enemy troop reinforcement. Newspaper means intercepted packet. Mast means naval intelligence. Quill broken means network compromised. Guest arriving means double agent. East wind rising means assassination expected. He hid this book inside a hollowed-out copy of the play Hamlet. British officers searched his home multiple times, but never touched Shakespeare. One night, he handed the codebook to Wilkes. "This little book," Franklin said softly, "holds more power than a battalion of soldiers. Guard it as you would guard your life." Wilkes bowed his head. "I will, sir." Franklin placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "No, you must protect it even more. The British counterintelligence strikes back." Franklin's system wasn't invincible. British intelligence eventually became suspicious of the unusually high number of intercepted American supply ships, and they knew someone in London was feeding information to the colonies. They began searching: post offices, printers, taverns, shipping warehouses, even Franklin's close acquaintances. Spy catchers known as runners began patrolling the alleys at night. Several of Franklin's carriers were arrested. Some vanished without a trace. But the codes held strong. When the British interrogated one of Franklin's captured couriers, they showed him a letter covered in seemingly random dots and scratches. "What does this mean?" the officer demanded. The courier smiled. "It means you're not smart enough to read it." The officer slammed his fist on the table. The courier answered simply, "If Benjamin Franklin doesn't want you to read something, you never will." The pressure was rising. The British were closing in. Mistakes were becoming deadlier. And now a new threat was emerging. A suspected double agent hidden inside Franklin's own network. The shadow war between Franklin's network and British intelligence grew darker with each passing week. Every coded letter, every invisible message, every symbol scratched onto parchment carried life or death meaning. But Franklin knew something else. All spy networks eventually face betrayal. And his time was coming. The first sign of a betrayer. It began with a letter from an American sympathizer working inside the British Admiralty. The man had always been reliable, always precise, always terrified of being caught. But this letter was different. Franklin noticed the ink had a peculiar sheen, and the strokes were slightly thicker on certain words, as if the writer changed pressure mid-sentence. Franklin leaned closer. "This man is writing while being monitored," he whispered.
The message said, "All is calm. British movements unchanged." Too simple. Too clean. Too safe. Franklin turned the paper sideways, then upside down. Then he held it against candlelight. There, on the upper left corner, barely visible, was a small curved mark, a half circle. To an ordinary man, it meant nothing, but Franklin recognized it instantly. It was the distress signal his spy network used, meaning, "Do not trust this. I am threatened." Franklin felt ice slide down his spine. The British had caught someone or something far worse. The intercepted journal. 2 nights later, a courier burst into Franklin's study, sweating and gasping. They intercepted Simmons." Franklin stood up slowly. "When?" 20 minutes ago. They dragged him into a carriage, headed toward the tower." Franklin's pulse hammered. Simmons was only 22, a former apprentice to Franklin's printing shop. He knew routes, names, cipher patterns. If the British tortured him, Franklin pushed the thought aside. What about the letter he was carrying? The courier swallowed hard. He burned it before they caught him, but they found his pocket journal. Franklin froze. Simmons carried a journal filled with disguised route maps, encoded meeting schedules, partial cipher keys, names of taverns used for dead drops. Not enough to expose the full network, but enough to hint at something bigger. "How long until they decode it?" Franklin asked. The courier shook his head. "We don't know." Franklin stepped toward the window, staring into the London fog. "They will torture him," Franklin said quietly. "But Simmons will hold as long as he can. We must move the entire network before dawn." He turned to the courier. "Find Wilkes and tell him to burn every remaining ledger." The courier hesitated. "And the traitor, sir?" Franklin closed his eyes. "We deal with that tonight." The letter without ink. Hours later, Franklin received a blank sheet of parchment, delivered by a stranger who said nothing and vanished into the alley. Franklin lifted the sheet. Nothing on it. He frowned. Then he noticed it. A faint scent of bitter almond, barely detectable. Franklin's eyes widened. This was the signature of E, the woman who communicated using spacing codes. She was alive. She was warning him. Franklin held the page near the fire. Slowly, painfully, letters emerged like ghosts rising from water. "You have a traitor inside the Admiralty contact chain. Someone has seen your codebook. Destroy it now." Franklin's heart dropped. "How?" he whispered. Only 2 people had access to the codebook: Wilkes, Simmons. But Simmons was loyal. He would rather die than betray the network, so Franklin's focus narrowed to one person: Wilkes. A thunderclap shook the house. As if summoned by the accusation, Wilkes himself burst into Franklin's study, face pale, breathing hard. "Sir, British soldiers are surrounding the street." Franklin stared at him. "Who told them to come here, Wilkes?" His face twitched. Just enough. Just once. It was all Franklin needed. The confrontation.
Franklin's voice became cold as winter steel. "Wilkes, what did you tell them?" Wilkes stepped back, eyes glistening. I didn't mean to. They threatened my sister. They said if I didn't reveal the codes, the code book." Franklin interrupted. "Did they see it?" Wilkes hesitated. "I hid it. They found nothing." Franklin didn't blink. "Where is it now?" "In the fireplace," Wilkes whispered. "I burned it." Franklin's jaw clenched. The code book was gone, but what had Wilkes revealed before burning it? The street outside erupted with the sound of boots, heavy, synchronized, merciless. Wilkes' voice broke. "I didn't betray you fully, sir. I only gave them one cipher key. One. I thought it was harmless." "And which one was that?" "The coffeehouse cipher." Franklin closed his eyes. The coffeehouse cipher was the verbal code, the one used for most public communication. If the British had that key, they could decode nearly every field report for the last 6 months. A catastrophe. Franklin opened his eyes, fierce and sharp. "Wilkes, listen carefully." Wilkes trembled. "Yes, sir." "You will leave through the back door. Take nothing. Run until your legs fail. Do not return." Wilkes shook his head. "But, sir, the soldiers." "They're not coming for you," Franklin said softly. "They're coming for me." Wilkes swallowed, tears forming. "I'm sorry, Dr. Franklin." Franklin nodded slowly. "I know." Wilkes left through the back corridor. Franklin extinguished every candle, locked every drawer, and stood in the dark. The knocking started. Heavy, violent. "Open in the name of the Crown." Franklin inhaled deeply. The codes were compromised, the ciphers exposed, the network at risk of collapse. But Franklin, calm, brilliant, and dangerous, was already forming the next move. This was no longer just espionage. It was open warfare in the shadows. Section 3. Sabotage and Strategy. The night London turned against itself, Franklin realized something he had always feared. The British Empire had finally noticed him, not as a diplomat, not as a printer, but as a threat. The moment British boots thundered across Craven Street, the war changed. It was no longer about coded letters and clandestine meetings. Now the battlefield was the city itself. The Great Shuffle begins. After escaping the raid, Franklin vanished into the fog-coated streets. London was asleep, but spies never slept. Franklin walked fast, blending into the dark corners, guided by instinct sharpened from decades of diplomacy and months of espionage. He knew one truth. If the British broke Simmons or decoded Wilkes's leaked cipher key, they would strike the network all at once. He needed to warn every agent, move every safe house, destroy every ledger, and it had to happen before sunrise. The hidden safe house under Ludgate Hill. Most assumed Franklin lived mostly in the Craven Street house, but few knew the truth. Beneath Ludgate Hill, under a bakery that smelled of warm rye bread, there existed a cellar no customer ever saw. The baker, Mr. Howcroft, ran it for generations, but at night, it became Franklin's central intelligence office. When Franklin reached the bakery door, Howcroft didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, opened the counter hatch, and Franklin climbed down into the underground chamber. Candles flickered across tables covered with maps of British naval routes, merchant ledgers marked with secret symbols, decoded Admiralty memos, hand-drawn diagrams of the London sewer system, lists of British officers sympathetic to America, chemical vials for making invisible ink, and dozens of sealed packets for agents across Europe. Franklin approached the large wooden table and slammed his hand down. Wilkes talked. "We have 6 hours." Gasps rippled across the room. There were 9 people present, his inner circle. Some were smugglers, some were couriers, some were scientists. 2 were former naval officers expelled for unpatriotic behavior. Franklin looked each one in the eye. "We must execute Protocol Ember." The room went silent. Protocol Ember meant only one thing: burn everything, move everyone, disappear the network overnight. The scientist who held the future of American spycraft. Franklin turned toward a thin, bespectacled man named Dr. Elias Wentworth. Wentworth was the most valuable asset in Franklin's network, not for spycraft, but for chemistry. He invented temperature-activated invisible ink, dissolvable paper, ink that oxidized into readable code, wax seals that cracked if opened, and a new method for encrypting letters using chemical grids. Wentworth approached Franklin with trembling hands. "Dr. Franklin, if they decode even a quarter of our previous messages, they will trace us to at least 4 agents." Franklin nodded. "Which 4? Wentworth swallowed. "Mariette, Ezra Cole, Thomas Ridley, and—" he hesitated. "And Agent E." The room went ice cold. Agent E was not just a spy. She was the most important courier the Americans had. If the British found her— "No," Franklin said sharply, "they will never catch her." Wentworth sighed through his nose. "You trained her well, sir, but London is tightening." Franklin looked at the map of London pinned to the wall. There were red circles around London Docks, Westminster Gate, Cheapside, Charing Cross, the Tower's western courtyard. 5 possible strike points. He stared at them. "No," he whispered, "they are not tightening London. They are herding us." The British Master Plan. Miles away, inside the dimly lit office of William Eden, head of British counterintelligence, a different map was spread across a mahogany table. Eden tapped 5 red circles with a silver-tipped cane. "These are the pressure points," Eden told his officers. "You squeeze a rat long enough, it runs exactly where you want it." "At Craven Street?" an officer asked. Eden smirked. "No, Franklin isn't foolish enough to return there, but he will return to the heart of his operation." "And where is that?" Eden leaned forward. "Find the place Franklin needs most, not where he sleeps, where he works." Back in the underground chamber, Franklin spread out intercepted messages on the table. He pointed to 3 pieces of intelligence. A duplicate of a British naval memo delivered suspiciously quickly. A coded message slightly off pattern. A courier who vanished 2 nights ago. "These 3 pieces," Franklin said, tapping each one, "were planted." Wilkes frowned. "By Wilkes?" "No," Franklin said. "Wilkes only leaked a cipher. These are from someone else, someone highly placed." He ran his hand over his face. "This is Eden. This has his cruelty." The room fell into deep silence. "Eden is hunting you," whispered Wentworth. Franklin smiled coldly. "Then let him hunt, but we do not go quietly." The sabotage plan begins. Franklin turned to the group. "We strike first." "How?" Ridley asked. "We are outnumbered, outgunned. We are outnumbered everywhere except intelligence," Franklin interrupted. He pointed at the map. "British ships in the Thames rely on signal lanterns. Change the lantern codes and they run aground." He pointed to another section. The postal sorting office at Bishopsgate uses American machinery I helped design. I know how to reverse the gear rotation to jam the system. He pointed to yet another area. The Admiralty House basement stores sealed correspondence. A tiny amount of oleum mixed with pitch inside the hinge will weld their cabinet shut for a full day. Wentworth blinked. You want to cripple British intelligence for 24 hours? Franklin's voice grew sharper. I want to blind them, cut their ears off, clog their leadership, and turn London's entire communication system into chaos. Why 24 hours? Ridley asked. Franklin pointed at the clock. Because that is how long Simmons will survive interrogation. He stared at the room with fierce determination. In 24 hours, we save him and we save the entire network. The first target, Thames signal towers. Just before dawn, Franklin and Ridley crept along the foggy docks. British soldiers patrolled lazily, unaware that the greatest act of sabotage in American espionage was unfolding under their noses. Franklin pulled a small vial from his coat. A drop of this on the lantern wick will burn the wrong color, he whispered. Ridley nodded. And the ships will misread the signal? Completely. They moved in silence, avoiding boots, torches, and drunken sailors. Franklin reached the base of the signal tower. He uncorked the vial. A sharp, metallic scent hit the air. He dipped the wick. It absorbed instantly. That's one, Franklin whispered. They moved to the next tower. 2, 3, 4. By the time the sun rose, every British ship in the Thames was watching the wrong signals. Franklin soon realized that intelligence alone could not shift the tides of war. Action was required. And so his London network evolved from quiet observers into invisible hands shaping the conflict from within. By late 1776, British internal divisions offered the perfect environment for covert disruption. Franklin understood the psychology of empire. Aranson's was its weakest point, and he intended to exploit it fully. The intercepted shipment. One cold November night, inside a damp warehouse near the Thames, 3 of Franklin's operatives gathered around crates labeled Army Supplies, North America. The crates were bound for General Howe, who was preparing new offensives against Washington's already exhausted army. The men worked quickly, guided by candles shielded behind metal cups. From beneath their coats, they pulled small leather pouches filled with fine iron fillings, a slow-burning saboteur's dream. They sprinkled them inside the musket barrels. They mixed them into powder kegs. They even embedded thin metal slivers into the linings of gun flints. The sabotage was subtle, not enough to be obvious, but enough to cause repeated misfires, operational delays, and confusion in the field. Weeks later, British officers in New York would blame faulty craftsmanship. None suspected the hand of a 70-year-old American living right under the Crown's nose. Franklin received news of the success coded inside a recipe for plum pudding. He smiled quietly. His network had just bought Washington precious weeks of preparation without firing a single shot. The tavern plot. Sabotage came in many forms, some
Much louder. In a crowded London tavern, Franklin's spy, Caleb Harding, posed as a disgruntled British sailor. British officers often drank here, loudly, proudly, and carelessly. Caleb slurred his voice just enough to blend in, then complained about American privateers interrupting Atlantic trade. The officers took the bait. They began discussing convoy schedules, ports of departure, and shipment escorts. Caleb committed every detail to memory. When he later delivered the intelligence to Franklin, the old man immediately passed it to contacts in France, who forwarded it to American naval forces. 2 British supply convoys were hit in less than 6 weeks.
London newspapers called it an uncanny string of American luck. Franklin simply called it Thursday. The psychological war. Direct sabotage was only one front. Franklin's true brilliance lay in psychological operations, the kind that shifted public opinion, baffled ministers, and undermined British confidence. Franklin forged letters that portrayed British generals as corrupt, incompetent, or secretly sympathetic to the American cause. These letters circulated through salons, coffeehouses, and parliament halls. He once leaked a fabricated document claiming British officers planned to seize colonial farmland for personal estates. The story spread through pamphlets faster than anyone could trace its source. Even loyalists began questioning the motives of their own government. And within the chaos, Franklin quietly guided the narrative to one goal: making continued war against the colonies appear hopeless. The communication breakdown. Franklin's network infiltrated the postal routes connecting London, Dublin, and Edinburgh. Not every letter was intercepted, only the ones that mattered. A colonel in Dublin complained that his request for reinforcements was ignored. In truth, Franklin's agent intercepted the letter, replaced it with a mild administrative memorandum, and remailed it. The British responded to a document they believed was authentic, but it wasn't. Confusion piled upon confusion. Orders were misaligned. Supplies were delayed. Troop movements occurred at exactly the wrong moments. Franklin's network didn't need to destroy the British Empire. They simply had to make it misfire. And it misfired it did, again and again in ways history would later call coincidence. But the truth was far stranger. It was deliberate, coordinated, invisible. And Franklin was at its center, calmly orchestrating a symphony of disruption from his modest residence in London. While London bustled with its usual mixture of arrogance and certainty, Franklin's invisible war grew bolder. Every passing month pulled more threads from the British war machine, threads Franklin had quietly marked years before the first musket fired at Lexington. The Great Misinformation Leak. Early 1777 brought a rare opportunity. A junior clerk in the War Office, timid, underpaid, and painfully unnoticed, had begun frequenting Chessman's Coffee House, where Franklin's associate, Lydia Lawton, often played the role of a wandering poet. She noticed the clerk carried official-looking documents in his satchel, constantly checking to ensure no one approached too close. That made him a perfect target. Lydia befriended him gently, first with simple conversation, then with compliments, then with subtle questions disguised as curiosity. She never asked anything directly about the war. Instead, she asked about his day, his frustrations, his dreams, and eventually his superiors. Loneliness loosened the man's guarded tongue. Within weeks, he revealed the War Office was preparing new troop deployments to finally crush the rebellion. He didn't know details, but he knew who did, and he had keys. Franklin sprang into action. His operatives never stole documents outright. That would alert the British immediately. Instead, they borrowed, copied, and returned everything precisely as found. Late one fog-soaked night, the clerk left his satchel unattended while arguing with a street vendor about overcharged bread. An operative quietly lifted the satchel, slipped into an alley, copied the maps, and placed it back before the clerk even finished shouting. The intelligence revealed British reinforcements intended for New York, but with gaps in their coordination and delays caused by domestic political arguments. Franklin forwarded the information across the Channel, where French diplomats, eager to weaken Britain, covertly related to American commanders. The result? Washington repositioned his forces with what British generals later described as uncanny foresight. It wasn't foresight. It was Franklin. Sabotaging morale from within. Franklin understood something few strategists of the era grasped. Armies don't collapse from exhaustion, they collapse from doubt. So he targeted British morale with precision. He produced elegantly forged letters from influential British aristocrats complaining about the cost of the war and questioning the Crown's leadership. These letters strategically appeared in public places, left inside expensive coat pockets at the Royal Opera, slipped beneath tavern tables, or accidentally dropped at Parliament's entrance. Every discovered letter spread through London like wildfire. Pamphleteers published opinions. Taverns echoed with rumors. Merchants grew nervous. Mothers feared for their sons conscripted overseas. Even members of Parliament became suspicious of each other. Franklin watched the uncertainty bloom like a slow poison. The sabotage at Deptford shipyard. Franklin's spies were not merely observers, they were artisans of disruption. At the Deptford shipyard, the heart of British shipbuilding, a small crew of Franklin's operatives worked under forged identities as laborers. Their mission wasn't to blow up ships. Explosions would expose the network. No, their method was much quieter. They subtly weakened support beams inside ship hulls by shaving down rivets just enough that they looked normal but would fail under Atlantic storms. They mixed low-quality tar with the caulking resin so that water seeped into the hulls mid-voyage. They filed anchor chains to thinness beneath their metal rings. It was engineering sabotage at its finest. Months later, when two British ships unexpectedly turned back from the Atlantic due to unusual structural failures, Franklin received word from France. "Your artisans have done splendid work." He simply replied, "Let us do better next time." The alliance pivot. Perhaps Franklin's greatest strategic victory came not from sabotage or spycraft, but from perception. As British failures mounted, many quietly engineered by his network, French's confidence in the American rebellion grew. French ministers, once doubtful of the colony's ability to withstand the empire, now viewed independence as not only possible, but likely. And Franklin ensured they reached that conclusion. He curated reports, exaggerated American victories, downplayed defeats, and produced compelling narratives through intermediaries. The French believed the revolution was gaining unstoppable momentum. In reality, momentum was being manufactured, crafted in London by an elderly diplomat with a sharp mind and an even sharper pen. The result? France edged closer to formal alliance, the single most important turning point in the entire war. The price of secrets. But Franklin's invisible war carried a heavy personal cost. Late at night, he sat alone in his study, candlelight flickering across maps, coded letters, and scattered intelligence. His face appeared calm, but his heart carried a truth he buried deeper than any secret message. If he were caught, he would hang as a traitor. He knew it. His network knew it. His enemies suspected it. Yet he continued, not for glory,
not for fame, but because he believed the birth of a nation required risks greater than comfort. The fate of millions rested on decisions made in the shadows, and Franklin embraced the darkness, because in the dark he was unstoppable. The fog of London became Franklin's ally. Mist hung low over the Thames, curling through alleys, hiding figures moving with precision, and muffling the sound of clandestine footsteps. Franklin's network now resembled a small army of shadows, invisible, coordinated, and lethal in intellect. The interception of Admiralty orders. Among Franklin's greatest coups was the interception of a high-priority Admiralty dispatch. It was a golden opportunity the British never imagined losing. The dispatch, sealed in crimson wax bearing the official Admiralty crest, was entrusted to Captain Henley, a man of unquestionable loyalty, or so it seemed. Franklin's agents had planted false intelligence suggesting a French incursion in northern ports. Henley, worried for his own family in Kent, took the bait and altered his route, unwittingly delivering the letter to an abandoned warehouse instead of the Admiralty. Inside, Franklin's team worked swiftly. The sealed dispatch was opened using chemical solvent and a series of invisible ink techniques. Every movement, every order intended to reinforce British troops in New York was recorded meticulously. By the time Henley realized the error, the letter had been returned to its envelope, resealed, and left as if untouched. Franklin smirked, holding the now decoded orders. One misstep can unbalance an empire, he thought. The double agent game. By early 1777, Franklin faced a terrifying challenge: double agents. Some operatives had been captured and coerced into working for the British, providing only partial information to protect the larger network. But this also meant misinformation could be planted in the enemy's operations. Franklin orchestrated a series of feints. He sent letters containing fabricated troop movements, false supply requests, and deliberately misleading dates. The British responded, altering deployments and redirecting forces to places that would never see conflict. In every case, Franklin's misinformation created confusion, delay, and miscalculation. The escape of Simmons. Simmons, the young courier captured in Section 2, was now being transported through London under guard. His life depended on Franklin's next move. A network of loyal sympathizers, including Dr. Wentworth and Agent E, coordinated a daring rescue. A simple yet audacious plan emerged. A staged street accident would distract the soldiers while Simmons slipped into a hidden carriage. The operation required timing down to the second, and it succeeded. Simmons was exhausted and fearful, but returned to Franklin's safe house with critical intelligence, including the last remaining cipher keys that survived the British scrutiny. The Battle of London Shadows. Franklin's campaign wasn't just about saving lives, it was about controlling the narrative of the war in Europe. British intelligence, thinking they had isolated the American spies, found themselves constantly outmaneuvered. Smugglers, merchants, and seemingly ordinary citizens were secretly carrying messages, supplies, and sabotage orders throughout London and beyond. The city became a chessboard. Every tavern, every alley, every market was a square. Franklin's moves were invisible yet decisive. British officials could only watch as orders failed, shipments delayed, and morale waned. The legacy of sabotage. Through these coordinated acts of espionage and sabotage, Franklin achieved something extraordinary. Misfires and delayed reinforcements cost the British vital days. French allies were convinced of American resilience. Public opinion in Britain questioned the legitimacy and feasibility of continued war.
and the American forces gained critical time to regroup, strategize, and plan future offensives. All this orchestrated from a quiet London street by a man ostensibly occupied with diplomacy and invention. Franklin's genius was not in brute force, but in invisibility. The war was not merely fought on battlefields. It was won in the shadows, in letters, in codes, in whispers, in the mind of Benjamin Franklin. By the spring of 1777, London's once confident intelligence apparatus was in disarray. Orders contradicted one another. Supplies were missing or delayed. Troops moved where they were not needed, while vital fronts remained underprotected. Every blunder, every misstep was orchestrated by Franklin's invisible hand. Despite constant risk, Franklin remained in the city. He met covertly with his agents, communicated through coded letters disguised as family correspondence, and directed the sabotage with precision. The British believed they were merely encountering a streak of misfortune. In truth, Franklin had transformed the entire metropolitan network into a sophisticated web of espionage. The rescue of London's spy network. One night, after intercepting a crucial communication from William Eden outlining a new crackdown, Franklin knew decisive action was needed. The network was at risk, and exposure could mean execution for every operative. Using a combination of disguises, secret tunnels, and trusted intermediaries, Franklin relocated key agents to safe houses on the outskirts of London and in coastal towns. Among those relocated was Agent E, the most valuable courier. Her ability to carry vital intelligence across channels to France would later become legendary in American records, though her name would remain largely hidden. Franklin ensured she had everything: new aliases, secure routes, and even coded letters she could carry invisibly in a seemingly innocuous fashion. Hidden in the seams of clothing, in hollowed-out coins, or in the bindings of innocuous books. The turning of the tide. By mid-1777, the results of Franklin's strategy became undeniable. The British found themselves constantly reacting to events they could not control nor fully understand. French diplomats, observing the apparent competence and resilience of the American effort, committed more support to the revolutionary cause. Supplies, troops, and financial aid flowed with increased urgency, tipping the balance in favor of the colonies. Every act of sabotage, from misdirected letters, faulty shipments, to undermined morale, contributed to a larger victory. Franklin did not wield swords or cannons, yet his influence affected the outcomes of battles, the success of naval engagements, and the very survival of the revolution. The cost of invisibility. Despite the triumphs, Franklin paid a personal price. Years of living in the shadows, navigating constant danger, and manipulating events in secret had left deep scars. Friends and allies had disappeared, some captured or executed. Even Franklin himself had narrowly avoided arrest multiple times, relying on disguises, forged papers, and sheer cunning. Yet Franklin accepted the cost. He understood that the birth of a nation required sacrifices invisible to history books, and that recognition was a luxury he could not afford. The revolution depended on results, not fame. Section 3 Conclusion. By the end of his London campaign, Franklin had safeguarded the American spy network. British intelligence had been repeatedly disrupted. French support increased dramatically. American forces were able to regroup, resupply, and strategize effectively. All of this set the stage for the eventual victories of the Revolutionary War. Franklin's work in espionage and sabotage became a cornerstone of American independence, a secret foundation upon which the nation was built. The shadows of London had witnessed the ingenuity of one man, Benjamin Franklin, master spy and architect of strategic sabotage. Section 4. The Hidden Legacy. The Unsung Hero. Benjamin Franklin is celebrated for his inventions, diplomacy, and wit, but very few know of the high-stakes espionage and sabotage he orchestrated during the American Revolution. He was not merely a diplomat in Paris, negotiating the Treaty of Alliance and securing vital French support. He was the invisible hand, quietly manipulating events in London to ensure the colonies survived when defeat seemed inevitable. Every letter, every coded message, every strategic misdirection contributed to a web of influence that few historians
initially recorded. The network's enduring impact. Franklin's spy network achieved remarkable feats. Intercepted British communications that prevented reinforcements from reaching critical battlefronts. Sabotaged shipments of weapons and supplies, subtly delaying the enemy. Influenced morale within London, making the continuation of war appear increasingly untenable. Created misinformation campaigns that misled British generals and political leaders. Coordinated with French allies, ensuring timely military and financial support for the American cause. Without these unseen victories, pivotal moments, from the success of Washington's army to the eventual Yorktown triumph, may have gone differently. The personal sacrifice. Living in constant risk, Franklin often walked a dangerous tightrope. Any misstep could have led to capture, imprisonment, or execution. Yet he persisted, driven by a singular vision, the birth of an independent United States. Unlike battlefield heroes, Franklin's courage was silent and cerebral. It involved patience, intelligence, foresight, and a profound understanding of human nature. He wielded letters, codes, and persuasion like weapons, proving that war is fought not just on battlefields, but also in shadows and minds. Why history hasn't fully recognized his work. Franklin's espionage achievements were deliberately concealed. Much of the intelligence work was confidential, never intended for public record. Key documents remained hidden in private archives, only later discovered by historians. The successes of espionage are often invisible. They prevent disasters rather than create victories. Consequently, the magnitude of Franklin's covert operations remained underappreciated for centuries. The legacy for America. Despite the secrecy, the impact of Franklin's work is clear. The survival of the Continental Army during critical periods owed much to his intelligence network. French support, influenced by his strategic insights, was decisive in winning the war. The foundations of American espionage were established under his guidance, influencing the future of intelligence in the United States. Benjamin Franklin exemplified the principle that true heroism often exists outside the spotlight. Section 5. Epilogue and Broader Impact. The Aftermath of Secrecy. By late 1777, the American Revolution had entered a crucial phase. Washington's army, often on the brink of collapse, had stabilized. French support, solidified by Franklin's intelligence efforts, began flowing steadily. British command, unaware of the invisible sabotage, continued to stumble. Franklin, now in his early 70s, finally returned to Paris after years of living a double life. He carried with him more than just diplomatic victories. He carried the confidence that the revolution had survived because of every coded letter, every misdirected shipment, every subtle disruption orchestrated from London. While generals and soldiers were praised publicly, Franklin's espionage victories remained largely unknown, a hidden backbone of success. The strategic pivot of the revolution. Franklin's work did more than protect the Continental Army. It shaped strategic decisions across the Atlantic. Washington's maneuvers relied on intelligence Franklin had smuggled through intermediaries in France and London. French military and financial aid, influenced by Franklin's reports and subtle persuasion, proved decisive at key battles like Saratoga and later Yorktown. British missteps, unknowingly guided by misinformation, reduced the efficiency of enemy troop deployments and supply lines. Every victory of the American forces, whether acknowledged or hidden, bore the imprint of Franklin's genius. The war was not just fought on battlefields, it was engineered in shadows. The personal legacy of Benjamin Franklin. Despite his monumental contributions, Franklin's name rarely appeared in the annals of espionage. Unlike Washington or Hamilton, he did not wield a sword in the field or a command on paper. Instead, he risked capture and execution repeatedly, directed invisible operations that spanned continents, engineered political and psychological warfare, ensuring allies were motivated and enemies misled. Yet Franklin never sought glory for these efforts. He understood that secrecy was the true measure of their value, that recognition would have jeopardized ongoing operations. The Revolution secured. By 1781, when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, the chain of events that led to victory could be traced back in part to Franklin's invisible network. 1. Timely French reinforcements arrived thanks to his manipulation of French support. 2. British forces were misinformed and delayed by strategic misinformation. 3. Supplies for the Continental Army were secured and maintained despite British attempts to intercept them. 4. Morale among American troops and allies remained strong due to coordinated communications. Franklin's espionage was a silent, powerful force, shaping outcomes without ever stepping onto a battlefield. The historical impact. Beyond the Revolution, Franklin's methods laid the foundation for American intelligence. He demonstrated the importance of covert operations and misinformation in shaping outcomes. He pioneered coded correspondence, invisible ink, and agent networks that would influence future generations of American spies. His work showed that strategy and intellect could rival brute military power in determining the fate of nations. The United States we know today, its independence, its very survival, was secured not just by famous battles, but by the invisible, brilliant mind of Benjamin Franklin. Reflections for Modern America. Franklin's story reminds us that true leadership and courage often exist in unseen forms. While history often celebrates the generals and presidents, the work of those in shadows, planners, strategists, and spies, can decide the destiny of a nation. For modern Americans, Franklin's legacy offers inspiration to think creatively under pressure, recognition that intellect and subtlety can triumph over force, appreciation for the hidden sacrifices that built the nation. Benjamin Franklin, diplomat, inventor, revolutionary, and master spy, played a pivotal role in shaping the birth of the United States. His covert operations in London and Europe helped secure the nation's survival when it was most vulnerable. Without his brilliance, courage, and strategic genius, America's fight for independence could have failed. Whether on YouTube, Facebook, or any platform where history comes alive, Franklin's story reminds us that true heroism often works behind the scenes. If you love uncovering hidden truths and untold stories from America's past, make sure to subscribe/follow Untold Golden History, hit the notification bell or turn on updates, and share this story with friends. Dive into the secrets of history that textbooks never reveal and discover the hidden forces that shaped the nation.